And welcome to the second of the video lessons essays. So for lesson 11, the second essay we'll be looking at is the idea of consolidation of power. This is how, essentially asking how Hitler went from a very weak, well-constructed, sort of limited chancellor of January 1933 to dictator, not all-powerful dictator, but dictator by August 1934. And the main question is essentially, how does he manage it? It's not what does he do to become dictator, and as we shall see, that's a common misconception. It's more, when you look at the steps he takes, how does he get away with it, number one, and how does this cement his control over German government and society? So the first thing you've got to think about is, what does Hitler want? Okay, and the first thing is, you could say broadly, totalitarianism. He wants a one-party state. There's not space in politics for alternative political positions. There's not the organisation to rally and therefore conspire against the Nazi state. There's no space for real debate on a political level outside the party. And therefore the Nazi party, and therefore Hitler, essentially control completely the political discourse and the political direction. This helps secure your power relative to other institutions. This helps you secure your power for longer periods of time because you haven't got rivals actively trying to undermine you or conspiring against you at any point. And this is essential for making sure that a dictatorship lasts for a long time. This revolution, however, has to be legal. It's not a seizure of power a la Munich Putsch. This is a dictatorship which has become a dictator through successive laws or legitimate means. Hitler is very aware that although the Nazis are popular, they aren't loved apart from a very small section of the population. And a lot of people who voted for them for pragmatic reasons as opposed to blind loyalty to Hitler. In addition, there's a large chunk of Germans, particularly ones in power, such as the elites, or with power, such as the Catholics in the south, who don't subscribe to him. And therefore, if there is a sense that Hitler is ruling due to illegitimate seizure of power, the danger is that Hitler will very quickly become subject to counter-revolution or subject to coup d'etat or removal. Whereas his belief is, if the seizure of power is largely legal, it goes through the approved mechanisms, it's seen as legitimate, it'll be harder for the opposition forces to rally enough discontent against him to unseat him. Naturally, all institutions, that's organisations and agencies and so on, which allow independent thought and actions. So everything from trade unions to press to the civil service to the judiciary to education, all areas of the state where people can think as a group independently, can organise as a group independently, can rally one another as a group, and they can exist and share ideas and share identities and share policies and share values which are not Nazi values. Those institutions need to go. They need to either be removed completely, such as trade unions, or they need to be Nazified, such as civil service, so that people who in those spaces either can't be quote unquote corrupted by non-Nazi ideas and therefore start sort of moving against the state, or they are being watched by the authorities in that institution, such as the people in charge of the Teachers League, for example. And the idea here is, it's about conformity and control, making sure the only ideas that people hear and therefore increasingly adopt are those approved by the Nazis, such as Volksgemeinschaft, and also there's not this space for independent opposition. This idea of independent opposition is absolutely vital to understand why and how the Nazis do something called Gleichschaltung. In addition, censorship and control of the media to make sure the narrative of what's happening is shaped, to make sure that only news that Nazis want people to hear get through, and that will help pacify or at least blunt anger. Even if you don't like the Nazis, it's hard to get angry when you're not sure what's going on. This is vital, therefore, to keep the domestic peace and order. We've already mentioned Nazification of institutions, and as well as that, the creation of a common Volk. Hitler looks at the world in very racial terms. Get rid of those common enemies, the Jews, the Bolsheviks, those who are outside the community. So that can be at any one point prostitutes, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, travellers, and so on. The idea here is about purging what was perceived as the racial enemies from the Nazi state in order to make a far more collective, effective Volk. So this is what he wants, and to some extent he'll never get here, but he gets closer, and particularly when you consider his position in 1933, where he is in theory controlled by the elites. Von Papen is the sort of watchman in the vice chancellorship, reporting directly to Hindenburg. Hindenburg controls the power with Article 48, the institutions of money, finance, business, land, judiciary, army, so on, are all controlled by the elites who are not massively sympathetic to Hitler. Hitler only has little bit of control over the cabinet. Cabinet is where most of the decision making used to be done, or should be done, and was done in the Weimar state, and less so beyond. The Nazis are also, if you compare the July to November elections, are declining in support. They don't necessarily have a majority of support, and even after an election, as we shall see, they don't really sort of hold that support above 50% at any real point. So the Nazis, therefore, essentially have a number of threats, a number of things limiting them and stopping Hitler from becoming dictator. Now, this is an exhaustive list, but these are probably the main ones we're going to talk about. Hindenburg obviously can use his Article 48, his power to dismiss the Chancellor, and his informal friendship and control of the army. Obviously, Hindenburg was a war hero, a member of the Prussian Junkers, and had very close relationships with the army, to overthrow and remove Hitler. So basically, Hindenburg is a kingmaker, and for as long as Hindenburg is in play and not completely pacified, he can remove Hitler at any one point. Next, along clockwise, is the Reichstag. They can do a vote of no confidence, much like Hitler did to von Papen. They can also pass laws that Hitler doesn't want. They can also just completely ignore Hitler and create all sorts of problems politically as a place to organise opposition to Hitler. It's basically a place where people are allowed legally to come up and say bad things about the Nazi state, say bad things about the person in charge. And the Reichstag, therefore, is in this idea of a totalitarian government where there is no dispute, there's only one party, there's no space for independent thought and organisation. The Reichstag is a real threat in that regard. Obviously, the cabinet and von Papen are an equal difficulty. If Hitler wants something done, it has to go through a cabinet. Hitler isn't, logistically simply can't run every office of state. Majority of the cabinet are DMVP or members of the elite. So, and almost all the important ones, apart from interior, are under the control of the elite. So, for example, Treasury. Hitler can demand all he wants, the cabinet, to do something, but there's no reason they have to follow him. Now, normally you'd say, well, they'll get fired. Obviously, Hitler, in this current situation where he has been put into power by Hindenburg and von Papen, who very clearly told him, this is your cabinet, Hitler doesn't really have the option to fire them, because then if he fires one of his cabinet members, then von Papen will tell Hindenburg very quickly, and then that whole deal of putting Hitler into power unravels, and Hitler runs the risk of losing power. Von Papen, as well, is also keeping an eye out for Hitler, watching his every move and acting almost as a shadow government. He's the guy who quietly organises the other elites, particularly in the cabinet but elsewhere, and makes sure they're very aware of what Hitler is trying to do, and making sure they're very aware they're all on the same hymn sheet in terms of making sure they're not slavishly following Hitler's will. So with von Papen and the cabinet still independent minded and still in independent hands, Hitler's going to find it very hard to push through a lot of his policies and get away with bending the rules too much with his night watchman, or the police sort of watchman looking over him, particularly von Papen. The elites dominate the civil service, judiciary. I put the army separately. We're going to talk about it separately. And land and moneyed society. They can use their significant political role, their institutional role by the control of civil service, and their financial role to really limit the power of Hitler. The civil service can start ignoring what they want, the judges can start ignoring what Hitler wants and doing their own thing and undermining him. Just think how they did to the SPD in the early 1920s. The elites can use their money either to help Hitler or to harm Hitler, supporting political opponents or supporting him, and that's going to make a massive difference to how much Hitler can get done. The elites themselves, particularly the top elites, the Junkers, all gather around Hindenburg, and they present a real threat, as well as Hindenburg, they gather around the army, a real threat to the political situation of Hitler. Hitler is confronted with a bunch of people who don't necessarily like him. They certainly don't love Nazism. They see Hitler as a useful tool. if they wanted to, they would be the greatest threat to be able to organise a counter-revolution against him. And indeed, the most successful plots against Hitler were eventually done by members of the elite in the army, something we'll talk about in a future lesson. So the elites do present a significant challenge to the Nazis, and it's one that Hitler never really will ever get hold of. Because of their dominant political, institutional and economic position, they have leverage. And Hitler's never going to be able, unlike Hindenburg, who's going to eventually die, and Reichstag von Papen and Cabinet, who Hitler will nullify, the elites, he can't bully into space. He can't remove the elites, because that will ultimately annoy them to the extent that they will do something. He's always got to pacify the elites, placate the elites, and get sympathy from the elites. Now, while pacifying and placating and sympathy does mean that they're less likely to take you on, it never removes their threat fully. And Hitler, although he's got this reputation as a very strong dictator, a dictator who's in complete control through fear, blah, 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 in reality, when we look at what and how he rules, Hitler is actually quite limited in what he can do by stuff that will ignore the elites and the army and some of the masses, and we'll talk about that shortly. And so we shouldn't expect Hitler to get complete power of them. Stuff he does do, however, does increase his support amongst them to some extent. And that's a very important thing to remember. So he needs to get, the elites can remove him and they need to be placated. He can't take them on. He can't fight them. And therefore, all the stuff what he's doing, you should focus on how does this placate the elites rather than gets control over them. This is the particular case of the army. The army control the means of violence, the means of force. And although Hitler increasingly, as we shall see in a future essay, makes the SS a parallel army to sort of balance the Wehrmacht, the German army, that will never really come into play to be truly equal before Hitler's death in the bunker. So the army are a sort of organising force. They're the pinnacle of Prussian militaristic society, so they tend to attract among the best and brightest of the Junker class. They're very closely aligned with Hindenburg. They have close relationships with the elites, thus von Papen and the cabinet. They are well respected in Germany, which still retains some of its militarism, so their word has a bit more sway. It helps that they're seen to be fair, unfairly, as being above politics. So they tend to retain a lot more Germans' respect, even if people have increasingly lost faith in normal government, be it Weimar or Nazi. The army also have the guns. With the guns, you can have the counter-revolution. Hitler is surrounded by army officers. Hitler is surrounded by soldiers. All it takes is a conspiracy among them to try and kill him, as we shall see with the von Stauffenberg affair in 1944, and there are numerous other threats and bomb plots and so on against Hitler in this time. So Hitler, to some extent, really needs to keep the army on board, and as we have seen, one of the first thing he does is try and placate them. Again, he can't remove the army. Eventually, he will try to with the SS, but it's all about placating and getting their sympathy. Now, the masses are a curious one because they're not one group, and we should sort of divide these into sort of the communists, the SPD, the middle ground, and the church. The communists, in theory, can do a counter-revolution against him. They can try and revolt against him and fight him and remove him power. For all the reasons we mentioned in the previous fear of communism paragraph and the weakness of opposition paragraph, is the reason why that was never really a threat. But some stuff he does nullify any potential threat from them pretty early, as we shall see, particularly after Reichstag fire. The SPD and the sort of other middling parties, who don't necessarily like Hitler, are a bit of a weird one. You could say, it just kills all. It needs to kill them all. The SPD is a lot of people. It's a good chunk of the German population, and not necessarily like the super radical. They're not violent. They're not a direct threat. So Hitler will end up deciding not really to terrorize them en masse, because as soon as you start terrorizing the communists, who are about 10 to 15% of the population, and the SPD, which is around 20% of the population, Hitler now has created enemies amongst them, at least 35 to 40% of the population, which means that you have massively increased the chance of revolution. If people think that they're going to get persecuted to death, they might as well try and take you out. Whereas what Hitler's going to do is he's going to keep them on their toes, he's going to keep them conforming, but he's going to try and avoid antagonizing them too much. They're going to sort of agree to disagree. Any outward show of defiance will obviously be punished, but he won't go too far into people's homes to root around to make sure they're being privately loyal. The other masses as well, obviously they can also unite against him. Remember, Hitler's attractiveness to the elites, Hitler's attractiveness to Hindenburg, is that Hitler is a popular enough amongst the masses that he can bring legitimacy to the dictatorship. He needs to keep the masses on side. Mass strikes, mass violence, mass revolution, mass force can create all sorts of problems for Hitler, which he doesn't necessarily need and only will weaken his position politically. So the masses themselves present a political challenge to him. He can't he can't root them out and kill them all, because logistically that's not going to work. It only provide more violence. And so he's going to go down a lot more a pleasing / conformity route, depending on who they are. The last group of the masses we're going to talk extensively about the religious, particularly the Catholics, although to a lesser extent the Protestants. As mentioned before, the Catholics, particularly religious, have a separate identity out compared to Nazis, and particularly the Catholics tended not to vote for Nazis. They didn't really have much sympathy for him, and although they politically hate the communists, and although they agree with some of the political positions of the Nazis, and Hitler certainly goes out of his way to help, to appeal to the church, they will never be really convinced. And the big threat of the Catholics isn't just because there's a lot of them, is that they're well organised, because Catholicism is a hierarchical institution with very clear chains of command along the religious. You listen to your bishop, he listens to his archbishop, and so on. But also they have a very strong identity. They are Catholics first, they are German second, almost. And certainly they have a stronger loyalty to the Pope, and they have a stronger loyalty to Christianity than they do Hitler. And that means they're more likely to take him on if they get annoyed. Finally, they're concentrated. Because they're all concentrated in one place, it's easier for them in this one village to unite and uprise, and it's harder for the Nazis to get reliable informants, reliable police officers, reliable even Gestapo agents to come in and see what's going on. If your group you're trying to infiltrate and threaten are all divided and broken up, like the Protestants are to some extent, they're easier to sort of divide and rule and pick up. Because the Catholics are all in one place, it's going to be hard for Nazis to get control of them. So because of their ability to organise, because of their sense of identity, which is separate and antagonistic to some extent to the Nazis, and because of the fact that it's harder, because they're concentrated and therefore easier to unite and harder to sort of break up, the church will be a significant challenge. And much like the elites, the Hitler will never get control of them. There will be bishops who, by all rights, should have been executed by the stuff they were saying and doing against Hitler. Well, sorry, by Hitler's logic, by rights. He will not do it because he just can't fight the church. And while he will eat away at their privileges, and while he might sort of challenge them subtly, Hitler sees the church as a longer term challenge to be dealt with, and he never lives long enough to really take him on. And the last threat is obviously for his own party. Since Bamberg, his party has been barely holding together, particularly with 1932 and 33, between the left and the right. He has moved to the centre, he's moved to the right, apologies, to appeal to the elites and the mass audience, and increasingly there's this sense of betrayal on his left, particularly amongst the SA. And Hitler just keeps them in line through force of personality and promising them that everything they ever wanted to happen will happen once Hitler comes to power. Essentially saying that Hitler is pretending to be a moderate, pretending to be a nationalist and a right-winger, but once he comes to power, that's when the revolution will happen. Now that serves him just well enough to keep everything together, although as we've mentioned before, the SA their violence does start becoming less controlled and more targeted towards people you don't want to target. People are fine with it if you beat up communists. It's less good if you beat up the police, Catholics, or innocent bystanders, but that will hurt your brand. But the SA is increasingly just off the train, but just held in line. This really is going to go off sort of out of control very quickly once Hitler becomes Chancellor, because he's now in power. That promise that now he's in power, he's going to be the one who sort of challenges it. He's going to be the one who challenges the elites and basically brings this sort of left-wing policy back. He's not going to follow it up. He still needs the elites. And so although he'll plead with them and beg them to obey, they're increasingly just going to become a rebellious force. They have the capacity to do two things. Obviously, revolt and remove him as leader. Fine. The likelihood of that succeeding is quite minor because up against them will be the army and so on. But the whole thing, even if the Hitler and the army win, it's going to make Hitler look a lot weaker, reduce the number of supporters he has because someone get killed, many others would leave, and therefore make him less attractive and politically weak. The other thing, though, they can do, and what's their biggest threat, is they're going to indulge their thuggishness, which means that they will increasingly start using violence more randomly. They'll start beating up people who German people are not happy with SA beating up. Religious figures, conservative figures, innocent bystanders, people who are in the government, like police officers. And although Hitler's going to be telling them they need to sort of stop, they need to hold back, they need to not use those violence, they need to obey, they're going to increasingly ignore him. And that's going to really undermine Hitler's sense of he's in control of his own party, Hitler's legitimacy, and how moderate. And that's going to really come to a head in something called Night of Long Knives, where that stops being a problem. So this essay is essentially, how does Hitler go from 1933, where he hasn't got control of these groups and these groups can undermine him, to a dictator where he either has complete control or at least a tentative sympathy implicating to get away with being a dictator in a year and a half, by August 1934. So the way he does this essentially is a little bit more complicated than the last essay. Now, where students go wrong is they will often list to me the various factors which have just appeared on the left. These are all the things that he did and all the steps he took to take power, to turn his chancellorship to a dictatorship. So from the law of the protection of German people to the Enabling Act to Concordat Road and so on and so on. These are all steps that essentially concrete steps that gain his power. And then what people like to do is they like to be paragraph 1, the Enabling Act, paragraph 2, Night Long Knives, paragraph 3, Concordat Rome. That is not asking the question. A lot of the questions are deliberately structured so you can't do that. They'll say, how far is terror responsible for Hitler coming to power? How far is the Enabling Act, Hitler himself responsible for him to power? And it's much more on the factors which enable him to do these actions in the green, rather than the actions themselves. So these paragraphs should be much more focused on the why and how, which is the orange, rather than the what, which is the green. The green, is the evidence. So you might say, paragraph 1, material interests was absolutely vital for Hitler coming to power. This is because Hitler will do, second bullet point down, public works and the employment law. This was vital for generating jobs for which group? The masses, particularly the working classes, as well as giving a sense that Germany was improving for the middle classes and the elites, and therefore legitimizing the Nazi state and giving almost more of the benefit of the doubt of Germany. Blah, blah, blah. Say if you say role of Hitler, how far is role of Hitler responsible? Hitler is vital in seizing power. This is because without his sense of direction and without his ability to exploit the fear of communism, for example, through the law of protection of German people and the Enabling Act, Hitler would not have got the extent of powers that he had. But because he is very good at exploiting the sense and working, for example, the right wing of the Centre Party to support him, blah, 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 blah. So what essentially we need to do in this essay, and where the difficulty is we are going to go through what he does, the green, in the next series of lessons. However, we are going to focus throughout is, how does this actually secure power? And what you're going to say is, green, Concordat of Rome, helps get blue, the church, more consolidated because in this way. Yeah, so we're not just saying, Concordat Rome, it's self-evident why that helps. We've got to say, because it allows the church, it takes the church out of politics, and it reassures them that the Nazis won't affect them, meaning they're less likely to resist challenges which were less directly concerning them. It basically isolates the church politically and basically takes them off the chessboard, essentially. This was managed because, and you pick one of those, because the terror, because the church were intimidated by what they saw was going on in Dachau, and they'd rather be on the right side of Hitler than the wrong side, because the role of Hitler, his ability to get sympathy and be able to persuade them, because of the weakness of opposition, because of the Catholic Church fundamentally agreed with them, because of the Nazi policies, about how particularly the church didn't disagree with a lot of what Nazis were doing, particularly around the social conservatism and the communists and so on. So, we do not care. We do not care about the green. The green are the evidence. This essay is all about how this actually makes it more powerful, i.e. how does this secure his control or sympathy among these key groups here, the groups we mentioned here. How does this advance the ball, make these reds, yellows, greens, i.e. level of control, red, no control, green, complete control. How does this advance that ball? Okay, and then grouping these actions up into different categories. Overall, he was able to get night-long knives and whatever passed because of terror, because of Hitler's role, because of Hitler's control over the state. Now, these factors are not all the factors. These are the most common, and you can make your own. And the essay prompts often give ones which are unpredictable. But remember, what we're trying to do is say the way, the how, and the why. The way he got away with the Enabling Act, which was essential to destroy the Reichstag as an institution, turn the Reichstag off. The Reichstag is no longer a threat when it was compared to how it was in 1933. That was essential to discourage power, because as that meant the Reichstag could no longer be a site of opposition which could make laws against him and do vote no confidence. This means there was less opportunity for people to debate around him, blah, 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 blah. So in these next lessons, I will be talking extensively about the green. But when I talk about what happened, that's for me trying to make it obvious and make it easier for you to understand how to argue this. The important part, and what you should be making your notes, is how that leads to one or more of the groups in the blue getting consolidated, and what sort of consolidation. Were they destroyed as a force? Were they made more sympathetic? Were they complicated? Were they forced into conformity? These distinctions matter at the A&A star level. And then, which paragraphs you could use this for. Yes, as evidence of he uses theory of causalism, for example, the Enabling Act, blah, 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 blah. Hitler was a very skillful politician, for example, the Enabling Act, and so on. Okay, so remember, this is a thematic thing. I will walk you through which groups this is consolidated and which reason it was allowed as part of your lessons, as I already have done in my lessons if I teach you. But we really need to focus on this because it's the most common error on this, actually, I would say, fairly easy essay otherwise. Okay, next lesson, we're just going to rip right through the various sort of events in this period in order to explain why Hitler was able to come to power. Until then, hopefully you've understood this. Remember, if in doubt in this essay, you shouldn't be writing paragraphs leading with and headed by the green. It should be the orange. The green is your evidence of how he uses terror, how Hitler's role, how people with sympathetic policies, and so on. Thank you very much.